values. So when a white person holds objectionable views, racist views for instance, we rightly condemn them. But when equally unacceptable views or practices come from someone who isn't white, we've been too cautious, frankly even fearful, to stand up to them. The failure, for instance, of some to confront the horrors of forced marriage, the practice where some young girls are bullied and sometimes taken abroad to marry someone when they don't want to, is a case in point. This hands-off tolerance has only served to reinforce the sense that not enough is shared. And this all leaves some young Muslims feeling rootless. And the search for something to belong to and something to believe in can lead them to this extremist ideology. Now, for sure, they don't turn into terrorists overnight. But what we see, and what we see in so many European countries, is a process of radicalisation. Internet chat rooms are virtual meeting places where attitudes are shared, strengthened and validated. In some mosques, preachers of hate can sow misinformation about the plight of Muslims elsewhere. In our communities, groups and organisations, led by young, dynamic leaders, promote separatism by encouraging Muslims to define themselves solely in terms of their religion. All these interactions can engender a sense of community, a substitute for what the wider society has failed to supply. Now you might say, as long as they're not hurting anyone, what is the problem with all this? Well, I'll tell you why. As evidence emerges about the backgrounds of those convicted of terrorist offences, it is clear that many of them were initially influenced by what some have called non-violent extremists, and they then took those radical beliefs to the next level by embracing violence. And I say this is an indictment of our approach to these issues in the past. And if we're to defeat this threat, I believe it is time to turn the page on the failed policies of the past. So first, instead of ignoring this extremist ideology, we, as governments and as societies, have got to confront it in all its forms. And second, instead of encouraging people to live apart, we need a clear sense of shared national identity that is open to everyone. Let me briefly take each in turn. First, confronting and undermining this ideology. Whether they are violent in their means or not, we must make it impossible for the extremists to succeed. Now, for governments, there are some obvious ways we can do this. We must ban preachers of hate coming to our countries. We must also prescribe organisations that incite terrorism against people at home and abroad. Governments must also be shrewder in dealing with those that, while they're non-violent, are in some cases part of the problem. We need to think much harder about who it's in the public interest to work with. Some organisations that seek to present themselves as a gateway to the Muslim community are showered with public money despite doing little to combat extremism. As others have observed, this is a bit like turning to a sort of right-wing fascist party to fight a violent white supremacist movement. So we should properly judge these organisations. Do they believe in universal human rights, including for women and people of other faiths? Do they believe in equality of all before the law? Do they believe in democracy and the right of people to elect their own government? Do they encourage integration or separation? These are the sorts of questions that we need to ask. Fail these tests, and the presumption should be not to engage with these organisations. So no public money, no sharing of platforms with ministers at home. At the same time, we must stop these groups from reaching people in publicly funded institutions like universities, or even in the British case, prisons. Now, some say this is not compatible with free speech and free intellectual inquiry. Well, I say, would you take the same view if these were right-wing extremists recruiting on our campuses? Would you advocate inaction if Christian fundamentalists who believe that Muslims are the enemy were leading prayer groups in our prison? And to those who say these non-violent extremists are actually helping to keep young, vulnerable men away from violence, I say nonsense. Would you allow the far-right groups a share of public funds if they promise to help you lure young white men away from fascist terrorism? Of course not. But at root, challenging this ideology means exposing its ideas for what they are, and that is completely unjustifiable. We need to argue that terrorism is wrong in all circumstances. We need to argue that prophecies of a global war of religion pitting Muslims against the rest of the world are nonsense. Now, governments cannot do this alone. The extremism we face is a distortion of Islam, so these arguments in part must be made by those within Islam. So let us give voice to those followers of Islam in our own countries, the vast, often unheard majority who despise the extremists and their worldview. Let us engage groups that share our aspirations. Now, second, we must build stronger societies and stronger identities at home. Frankly, we need a lot less of the passive tolerance of recent years and a much more active, muscular liberalism. A passively tolerant society says to its citizens, as long as you obey the law, we will just leave you alone. It stands neutral between different values. But I believe a genuinely liberal country does much more. It believes in certain values and actively promotes them. Freedom of speech, freedom of worship, democracy, the rule of law, equal rights, regardless of race, sex or sexuality. It says to its citizens, this is what defines us as a society. To belong here is to believe in these things. Now, each of us in our own countries, I believe, must be unambiguous and hard-nosed about this defence of our liberty. There are practical things that we can do as well. That includes making sure that immigrants speak the language of their new home and ensuring that people are educated in the elements of a common culture and curriculum. Back home, we're introducing National Citizen Service, a 2-month programme for 16-year-olds from different backgrounds to live and work together. I also believe we should encourage meaningful and active participation in society by shifting the balance of power away from the state and towards the people. That way, common purpose can be formed as people come together and work together in their neighbourhoods. It will also help build stronger pride in local identity, so people feel free to say, yes, I am a Muslim, I am a Hindu, I am a Christian, but I am also a Londoner or a Berliner too. It's that identity, that feeling of belonging in our countries, that I believe is the key to achieving true cohesion. So let me end with this. This terrorism is completely indiscriminate and has been thrust upon us. It cannot be ignored or contained. We have to confront it with confidence. Confront the ideology that drives it by defeating the ideas that warp so many young minds at their root. And confront the issues of identity that sustain it by standing for a much broader and generous vision of citizenship in our countries. Now, none of this will be easy. We will need stamina, patience and endurance. And it won't happen at all if we act alone. This ideology crosses not just our continent, but all continents. And we are all in this together. At stake are not just lives, it is our way of life. That is why this is a challenge we cannot avoid. It is one we must rise to and overcome. Thank you.